with the COVID-19 pandemic, we were shown the world seriously needed a restructure on pandemic preparation. What what would you do slash what do you think needs to happen to help us better prepare to handle the next pandemic?
That's open-ended.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, everything we've done since the start, we got to do the opposite of that. And that's the short answer. I'll throw a couple things out, and maybe Chris and Jenna, sorry, heck, now I did it. Katie, you got in my head, Chris.
I'm sorry, Katie.
Yeah,
It's fine. It's fine.
I'm sorry,
I gave
man.
Tom so much flack on the last episode for doing that too,
Yeah.
and now I did it myself too. So I feel I'm
Welcome to
Kind
the
of looks
club.
similar too, so it's still
Yeah, I think communication is key, right? Having a clear, decisive plan from the start, from higher ups, from on local levels, federal levels, institution levels. I think that can go a long way to getting the population to agree to a strategy and a plan and pull the trigger and get it done. Clearly, supply chain management, that's been a crucial thing of making PPE and getting it sent to the right places. And that's something that clearly needs to be worked on. There need to be more kind of flexibility there, that we can't just immediately get shut down. Just agreeing on different tests and what they mean. I think we talked briefly last time about the PCR test and CT values, and how there's still confusion on that side about what a positive PCR test means or doesn't mean. I'll drop off there. There's more to talk about, but if Katie or Chris want to throw more out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in the beginning, having a lack of testing was a big problem, right? Because then you're kind of flying blind as to, where are outbreaks happening, especially since there seems to be kind of a range of symptoms, right? So you have some people who are asymptomatic but can infect others. You have some people who are, ending up in the ICU. So there's a whole spectrum, right? And if you aren't testing, you don't really have a sense of how things are progressing, right? So I think other countries did a better job, early on getting wide scale testing available, and that made a big difference. So I think we're kind of paying the price a little bit for being slow with that. I mean, nothing like this has happened, in our lifetime. So I think it's hard to be prepared. But I think that we've definitely learned a lot about how to implement wide scale testing. So hopefully that is something that in the next, if it's something like this happens again, we can roll out much faster next time.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Well, the thoughts I have are, I agree with what Tom and Katie said. I think those are both excellent points. I think there's another conversation that needs to be had, and it's a difficult one to have, and it kind of circles back to what we were talking about earlier, where people aren't going back and learning. I find that I can forgive making when people make decisions without all the information, right? So I think there's a lot that, if you are to call a lot of the decisions at the beginning of the pandemic into question, there's a version of that that's Monday morning quarterbacking and saying, well, we didn't know, right? Why did we wipe down all the chip bags? Because we didn't know, right? That's right. Like, maybe it's on the food outside. I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Get the Lysol wipes. We'll figure it out. But there's a version of this too, where then people don't, like, there's not a lot of adaptation and repairing of things. And I think that ties into the other issue, which is there's a break between the science and the population, and there's not good translators in the middle. Scientists are not good translators in general. You found the only 4 people who can speak about this, but you can't communicate these ideas in 50-second sound bites. It just can't be done. Nobody could do it. And so there's a breakdown between what the labs are pumping out and then what the public sees and what's reported on it. And I think there's some good examples of that we need to fix as a society, right? We need more of these translators. So, one example that came to mind for me was, I remember early on, the reason we were wiping down all the groceries was there was one study that came out that said it can live for 3 or 4 days. The COVID virus can live for 3 or 4 days on a solid surface, right? But then if you looked into that study, what they did was they put COVID vaccine, they put viral particles on the ideal situation for a viral particle, right? They put it in an incubator with the right humidity on a plate that it liked, on stainless steel. Nobody was blowing wind on it, or, that they put it in the ideal situation. And then it turned out that if you just took that flask and put it outside for 15 minutes, it died,
Mhm.
right? And so there's a disconnect, right? So the first study comes out, and then it's just reported to the high heavens, right? COVID lives forever on everything. It's everywhere. It's a ghost, right? It's just everywhere. It's in your house. It's on your food. It's floating through the air through your window, right? It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And there wasn't anybody to stop and say, listen, we publish these studies all the time, right? Like we publish studies, and it happens a lot in the immuno-oncology field, right? I feel really bad for cancer patients because I feel like cancer patients get stung by this particular problem a lot. And this was the first time the general public got stung by it. So cancer research has this problem, which is lots of people will publish a study, and then a news organization will pick it up and they'll say, new drug XYZ, is it the new breakthrough for cancer? And so that if you're a cancer patient, you go, what is it, right? Like, I need answers, I need options.
Mhm.
So you look into it. And then it turns out what they did was they put a cell line in a dish, and then they put some of the drug on top of it, and the cells died,
Mhm.
right? And there's a great XKCD comic about this where they say, I wish we had it. If we do show notes, I'll send it to you so we can link to it. But it's addressing this point, right? So the basic gist is whenever you see a study that says, this drug kills cancer in a dish, remember that that a gun does the same thing, right? If you happen to just shoot the dish and there was no more media in it, the cancer would die too. If you opened the dish and set it outside, it would die. If you put it in the microwave, it would die. If you just didn't feed it because you didn't want to go in on the weekend and change the media, it would die. And so there's an aspect of this where you need somebody to come out and say, listen, I understand their data is not wrong, but the interpretation is wrong,
Mhm.
right? When you put something in an ideal lab environment, it is not the same as putting it in real life. And so we sort of did that a lot of times, right? Like we would get whatever the panic thing of the moment was, and then it would get screamed to high heavens
Yeah.
without anybody going, hey, wait a second, like that doesn't say that, right? That's not what that looks like.
Mhm.
I mean, even now with right, we talked about the variants, right? I remember it was only December where everybody was talking about how the variants were coming and all the waves were going to happen, and these ones were infecting children. Watch out! And then cases dropped off, and now I read this morning that the variants are something like 20 or 30%, of the infections in the United States, but the cases still dropped off. It doesn't look like they infect children that much more. Right? Somebody had one inclination.
Yeah.
They published one study, and then everybody took it and ran with it like it was true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something that's been particularly hard, during COVID, because like the research is happening so fast and it gets picked up, and it's such, it's on everyone's mind, right? It's like affecting everyone's daily life. So I think, news organizations want to report on new things that are coming out, but a lot of times, yeah, there are caveats. I think it's kind of, you mentioned this earlier, Chris, this distinction between how we would talk about things and like as a scientist versus how, what is the way to talk about them for public health. And I think even now with, do you wear a mask after you get vaccinated? I think that there's the right public health answer, but maybe that like undermines some of the confidence in the science, right? Like, do I still need to wear a mask because the vaccine didn't work? And it's like, no, it works, but it's like we still want everyone to wear a mask, right? So
Right.
I think changing how we talk about these things is something that hopefully we all learn something from. Just because we're asking you to wear a mask after you get vaccinated doesn't mean the vaccine didn't work. It's just we think that most people should still be wearing masks, and if everyone stops, then people who aren't vaccinated lose that protection, right? So it's there's a lot of caveats to these things. I think you have to talk about them or say like why are we giving this type of advice, and not just expect people to follow it without understanding the reasons.
I think this summer, Chris, there was oftentimes when I would see something on the news, or like somebody that I had played soccer with 2 weeks before had like a positive case. I remember I called you a couple of times this summer and I was like, should I be worried about this or not? And every single time you were like, no, you're fine. I was like, okay.
Well, it's hard, right? I mean, it's the problem is that it's hard to come up with an example because there's not a lot of other arenas that affect everybody's life. But for maybe the first time in a long time, infectious disease became on everybody's plate, right? Everybody was looking at it going, what is this? Well, I heard somebody say this. Well, I heard somebody say that. And one of the things people don't understand too about sort of how the scientific publications work too, is that there's sort of two ways. There's a way science is supposed to work, and then there's a way that it kind of, I feel like, really does work. And you guys can comment on this one too. What's supposed to happen is, Eric, you publish a paper, right? And you say, this protein does this thing, right? And then Katie, Tom, and I all try to replicate it, right? Eric publishes it. And there's a version of this where it's like, I don't like Eric and I want to make him, pay for this. And then there's a version where I'm like, I really like Eric. Let's see if it works, right? Either way, I'm going to try and replicate what you did, right? And then what happens is, if I can't replicate it, but I also can't find anything wrong with your data, I just stop looking at it, right? That's what happens is I don't demand that you retract it. I don't call you out on the carpet and say, Eric, this data is wrong. I can't make it happen, right? So that's why you're wrong. Instead, we just sort of stop talking about it, right? And it just sort of goes away, and that's kind of it. And that, I feel like, has happened to a lot of things in COVID land too, right? Which is, we talk about this thing and then we just sort of stop talking about it, right? Like it just sort of goes away, right? Like we talked for a while about, over the summer, we talked that kids were super spreaders, right? Like it's not just that they spread it, they were super spreaders. And then we just sort of stopped talking about it, right? We didn't come back and say, like, nobody came out and did a newscast and said, look, in July, I said this thing and I feel really bad about it. They just sort of stop talking about it, right? It just goes away, right? We talked about Kawasaki syndrome in children, right? Like all the children who get it are getting this crazy multi-organ inflammatory disease. And then it turns out like it does happen, but it's pretty rare. So we just stopped talking about it, right? Or we talk about, right, like athletes are going to have myocarditis and heart damage. And then we just sort of stopped talking about it, right? And I mean, even like a week ago, I think it was the NBA, NFL, NHL, WNBA, they all published a joint statement where they took part in like this study. They did like a study, right? Because they had a bunch of athletes playing, and they had roughly 800 athletes test positive for COVID, and about 0.5% of them showed this heart damage phenotype, right? So they were scanning them and they showed inflammation of the heart. But I mean, this is their job. So those people went back to exercising like a week later, right? Like they got off their symptoms. And then a month later, their heart stuff resolved, right? Because that happens sometimes. You get these lingering scans. But again, nobody goes back and says, hey, listen, you remember when we were all like really worried about, right? We just stopped talking about it. That's what happened, is we just didn't say anything. But everybody kind of remembers. And so you're left with this sort of fear of like, well, what about that? Because nobody comes out and corrects it and is like, okay, no, I know we said that. My bad. Like now this is where we're at. And this is why. Here's the data. Yeah. I was worried about this. I saw this study, but I don't know how you have that conversation unless the public's willing to listen to an hour and a half of somebody going, here's the graphs I had, here's the new graphs, right? Like it's hard. And I think this arena is great. I mean, there's other long form podcasts to kind of discuss these things, but I don't know how you do it in a news cycle, in like a traditional news cycle. I don't know how what's the advantage to me going out on CNN or some other thing and knowing that I only have 30 seconds. And so for 20 of those seconds, I'm going to go, listen, I got this real wrong, but okay, now I'm cut to commercial.
Yeah, it sounds like hopefully we'll have learned some lessons for the next go around, if there is one. But yeah, I think just like interpretation of like what people are saying, just like staying calm, I think is probably the biggest thing. Like don't go out and buy all the toilet paper immediately. It's like would probably be a good start. But